Ethan's pulse raced as he crouched by the window, his breath barely a whisper. His fingers, pale from the cold, gripped the windowsill so tightly they hurt. Below, in the darkness, he saw the outline of her figure moving through the shadows. Victoria. The name alone sent a wave of dread rolling through his chest. He could hear her voice, faint but clear enough to send shivers down his spine. She was talking to someone he couldn't see. But he could hear her words, and each one felt like a knife twisting deeper into his gut. It's done. He'll be dead by the weekend. Ethan's stomach churned, his throat closed up, and for a moment he couldn't breathe. Did she really just say that? The cold air seemed to suffocate him, but nothing compared to the icy terror spreading through his veins. His father was going to die, and she was the one who would kill him. The money will be ours by then, Victoria's voice continued, smooth, calculating. She sounded so casual, so pleased. It was sickening. Ethan's heart pounded so loudly he was sure she would hear it. He leaned back from the window, pressing his body against the wall, trying to make himself as small as possible. His mind raced, panic clawing at his thoughts. What was he supposed to do? How could he stop this? But the truth was brutal and suffocating. He was just a kid, a scared, powerless kid. I need to tell Dad. The words slipped from his lips, but even as he whispered them, doubt filled his chest. James hadn't believed him before. Why would he believe him now? Every time Ethan had tried to tell his father that something felt wrong about Victoria, James had brushed him off with a distracted wave. "You're overreacting," he'd say. "Victoria loves us both." Ethan felt a sharp, bitter lump rise in his throat. His father had been so distant. Ever since Victoria had entered their lives, James had become like a ghost, always there but never really present. He was always at work or locked in his office with Victoria, planning their future together. A future where Ethan felt more like an afterthought. He won't listen to me, Ethan thought bitterly. His hands clenched into fists, his fingernails digging into his palms. The pain was sharp but distant, like everything else around him right now. He wanted to scream, to break something, to make someone, anyone, hear him. But what was the point? Every time he had tried to voice his concerns, he had been shut down, ignored, like his feelings didn't matter, like he didn't matter. The sound of footsteps pulled him out of his spiraling thoughts. His body went rigid with fear. Someone was coming. His heart slammed against his ribs as he crawled away from the window, his movements slow, deliberate. He slid beneath his bed, the space small and suffocating, but it was better than being found. The door creaked open. Victoria. Her heels clicked against the wooden floor with a steady, unnerving rhythm. Each step felt like a countdown, a ticking clock in the silence of the room. Ethan held his breath, his entire body shaking as he tried to remain completely still. "Ethan?" Her voice was soft, sweet, but there was something in it that made his skin crawl. "Where are you, sweetheart?" He bit down on his lip so hard he tasted blood. His eyes squeezed shut, praying she wouldn't look under the bed, praying she wouldn't find him. If she did, if she found him, he wasn't sure what she would do. The silence stretched out painfully as her shadow fell across the floor, creeping toward the bed like a predator closing in on its prey. Ethan felt his chest tighten with panic. He could hear his own heartbeat, thudding wildly in his ears. "Your father and we're planning something wonderful," she cooed, her voice dripping with a false warmth that made Ethan sick. "A little surprise for you. We're going to be a family, Ethan. Just imagine it." Family. The word felt like poison. This wasn't a family, it was a trap, and his father was walking right into it. And the worst part was, Ethan was the only one who knew. He was the only one who could stop it. But how? As soon as she stepped out of the room, Ethan let out a shaky breath. His body was trembling uncontrollably, the weight of everything crashing down on him like a tidal wave. Tears burned in his eyes, but he refused to let them fall. He couldn't afford to break down now. I have to stop her. The thought echoed in his mind, but it felt impossible. She was dangerous, calculating, manipulative. How could he possibly stop someone like her? But then the image of his father flashed in his mind. James, who had always been strong, always been his hero, even if he didn't see Ethan anymore. The thought of losing him, of Victoria taking him away forever, was unbearable. I won't let her take him from me. The resolve in Ethan's chest grew stronger, hardening like iron. He had to find a way, even if it meant going against everyone's doubts, even if it meant standing alone. He couldn't lose his father. Not again. Ethan lay on the floor of his room for what felt like hours, his thoughts swirling in a whirlwind of panic and determination. His mind kept returning to the same question. How could he stop her? He was just a kid. No one believed him. And Victoria. She was smart, far too smart. She had already twisted his father's perception, wrapped him around her finger like a puppet. James couldn't see her for what she really was. Think, Ethan, think, he whispered to himself, pacing the small space of his room as his breath came in shaky gasps. His heart still pounded with the remnants of fear from moments before, but he pushed it down, refusing to let it paralyze him. He didn't have time for fear, not now. His thoughts raced to his father, to the rare moments when James wasn't hidden behind walls of legal paperwork or lost in whispered conversations with Victoria. Ethan's heart ached at the memories of a time when his father had laughed more, when he'd looked at Ethan like he was his whole world. Now he barely glanced at him. It was like Ethan had faded into the background, a shadow in his own home. I can't let her take him away, he muttered, his voice breaking with the weight of it all. He couldn't lose his father, not after losing his mother. It would destroy him. And that was when the answer hit him. It wasn't about proving Victoria was dangerous, at least not right away. The first thing he needed to do was reconnect with his dad. Somehow, some way, he had to get James to see him again, to hear him. If he could break through that barrier, maybe, just maybe, he could convince him to see Victoria for who she really was. But how? As his mind wrestled with possibilities, there was a sudden knock at the door. Ethan froze, his body tensing automatically as his heart skipped a beat. For a split second the fear returned, but the voice on the other side was not Victoria's. Ethan. It was his father. The sound of his dad's voice, even now, sent a flood of conflicting emotions through Ethan's chest. He wanted to feel safe, but safety had become an illusion in this house. Still, the fact that James was here, outside his door, gave him a sliver of hope. He rushed to the door, flinging it open. James stood there, dressed in his usual suit, his expression tired and distant. His eyes barely met Ethan's as he spoke, his voice clipped and hurried. "We're heading out for dinner with some clients. Sarah will take care of you tonight." "Dad, wait!" Ethan blurted out before he could stop himself. His throat felt tight as he struggled to find the right words, knowing he had only a few seconds before his father was gone again. Can we talk?" James glanced at his watch, his brow furrowing slightly, as if even the smallest disruption was an inconvenience. "What's this about, Ethan?" The disappointment in his father's tone hit like a punch to the gut. Ethan's hands tightened into fists at his sides, as he fought the wave of frustration rising inside him. How could he make James see? How could he make him care? "It's important," Ethan pushed, his voice cracking. "It's about Victoria." James let out a heavy sigh, his shoulders sagging just a bit. "Ethan, we've been over this. I know you're still adjusting, but Victoria is a good woman. She cares about us, about you." "No, she doesn't!" The words burst out of Ethan before he could stop them. His heart pounded in his chest as desperation clawed its way up his throat. "She's lying to you, Dad. She doesn't love you. She's going to—" "Ethan, enough!" James's voice was sharp, and for the first time he looked directly at Ethan, his eyes filled with irritation. "You're just a kid. You don't understand how relationships work. Victoria and I are getting married, and you need to accept that." Ethan felt the sting of those words like a slap. His father's gaze was cold, dismissive, as if his concerns, his fear, his everything meant nothing. "But Dad, please—" "This conversation is over, Ethan." And just like that, James turned and walked away, leaving Ethan standing in the doorway, his fists still clenched, his whole body trembling with a mix of anger, fear, and helplessness. The door clicked shut behind his father, and Ethan stood frozen in place, his mind reeling. The cold emptiness of the house seemed to press in around him, the silence suffocating. He felt like he was drowning in it, drowning in the isolation, the fear, and the knowledge that no one was coming to save him. He couldn't wait for his father to wake up and see the truth. He had to act now, but what could he do? He was just a kid. No one believed him. No one would listen. As he stood there, staring at the door, the weight of it all crashed over him like a tidal wave. He felt tears prickling at the corners of his eyes, but he quickly wiped them away. Crying wouldn't help him now. He had to be strong, stronger than he'd ever been before. Then his mind flashed to one person. Someone who might help him. Someone who had always been there for him, even when his father wasn't. His aunt, Linda. She was the only one who had ever questioned Victoria's intentions. She had never said it outright, but Ethan had caught glimpses of her suspicion in the way she looked at Victoria, in the quiet conversations she'd had with him when James wasn't around. Maybe, just maybe, she would believe him. Ethan's chest tightened with hope, a glimmer of light in the darkness that surrounded him. He had to talk to her. He had to tell her everything. Without wasting another second, Ethan grabbed his jacket and hurried out of his room. He needed to find Linda, and fast, because the clock was ticking, and if he didn't act soon, it might be too late. Ethan darted down the stairs, his feet barely making a sound as he raced through the quiet house. The walls seemed to close in on him, thick with the weight of secrets. He could feel the urgency thrumming in his veins. Every second that passed brought Victoria closer to her plan, and time was running out. He needed to reach Linda before it was too late. She was the only one who might believe him, the only one who could help him stop this nightmare before it became a reality. As he reached the bottom of the stairs, Ethan paused for a moment, his heart racing. The living room was dark, the only light spilling in from the street outside. Everything in the house felt still, unnervingly so. He could hear the distant hum of the city, but inside it was as if the world had stopped moving. "Sarah?" he called out softly, his voice barely a whisper. The housekeeper had always been kind to him, but Ethan wasn't sure if he could trust her with this. What if she told Victoria? No response. The silence felt heavy, pressing down on him like a weight he couldn't shake. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to move. There was no time to hesitate. Ethan grabbed his backpack from the corner by the door, slipping into his jacket as he stepped out into the cold night air. The chill hit him instantly, but he barely noticed it. His mind was too focused, too consumed by the fear gnawing at his insides. He pulled his phone from his pocket, scrolling through his contacts until he found Aunt Linda's number. His fingers trembled slightly as he pressed the call button, lifting the phone to his ear. The ringing felt painfully long, each tone stretching out in his mind like an eternity. "Come on, Aunt Linda, please pick up," he whispered, his breath fogging up in the cool air. Finally, after what felt like forever, the line clicked, and he heard her voice. "Ethan?" She sounded surprised, a little breathless. "Is everything okay? It's late, honey." _ Aunt Linda, I need to talk to you. It's really important. His voice wavered slightly, but he forced himself to keep going. "I need your help. ___. There was a pause on the other end, and for a moment Ethan's heart sank. What if she didn't believe him either? What if she thought he was just being a paranoid kid, like his dad did? "Ethan, are you okay? What's going on?" Her voice softened, concerned. "It's Victoria. She's planning something, Aunt Linda, something bad. I overheard her on the phone. She's going to hurt Dad." The words spilled out in a rush, his chest tightening as he spoke them aloud. Saying it made it feel even more real, and the fear that had been gnawing at him all evening grew sharper. There was a long silence on the other end of the line, and Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. He could hear Linda breathing, and for a moment he feared the worst, that she wouldn't believe him, just like his father hadn't. But then, finally, she spoke. "Where are you, Ethan?" Her voice was steady, but there was an edge to it now, an urgency that matched his own. "I'm at home, but I need to get out. She's here, and I don't know what she'll do if she finds out I overheard her." "Stay where you are. I'm coming to get you." The relief that washed over him was almost overwhelming. For the first time in what felt like forever, Ethan felt like he wasn't completely alone. Someone believed him. Someone was coming to help. "Okay," he breathed, his voice shaky with emotion. "Please hurry." He hung up, tucking the phone back into his pocket as he paced the driveway, glancing nervously at the house. Every shadow seemed to loom larger, and every creak of the wind felt like a sign that Victoria was lurking nearby. His heart pounded with the fear that she would find him before Linda arrived. As he waited, the minutes dragged on painfully slow, each one a reminder of how fragile time was. His thoughts raced, replaying everything he had overheard, every word Victoria had said. The weight of it all felt crushing. How could one person be so twisted? How could his father not see it? His mind wandered back to his mother, to the memories of her gentle smile and warm embrace. She had always been the one to listen, the one to believe in him no matter what. But now she was gone, and with her, any sense of safety had disappeared. His father had tried to fill that void, but he'd failed. And now, with Victoria pulling the strings, it was like Ethan's entire world was crumbling around him. Just when the despair began to creep in again, the sound of tires crunching on gravel broke the silence. A wave of relief flooded through Ethan as he saw the familiar headlights of Linda's car pulling into the driveway. She barely had time to stop the car before Ethan rushed toward her, his heart racing with a mixture of fear and hope. Linda stepped out, her eyes wide with concern as she rushed over to him. "Ethan, what's going on?" she asked, her hands gripping his shoulders as she looked him over. "Tell me everything." And so, with the night pressing in around them, Ethan did. He told her everything, about Victoria's phone call, about the threats, about the way his father had dismissed all of his concerns. With each word, the fear and anger that had been building inside him spilled out, until there was nothing left but the raw, aching truth. Linda listened, her face growing more serious with every detail. When he finally finished, she took a deep breath, her jaw clenched tightly. "We need to go to the police," she said, her voice steady but firm. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. "The police? But what if they don't believe me either? What if they think I'm just a kid making stuff up?" "They'll believe us," Linda said, her eyes hard with determination. "We'll make them believe us. We're not going to let Victoria get away with this, Ethan. I promise." For the first time in days, Ethan felt a glimmer of hope, a small, fragile spark that maybe, just maybe, they could stop this before it was too late. The drive to the police station felt like an eternity. Every streetlight they passed seemed to stretch the shadows longer, casting eerie shapes across the dashboard. Ethan sat in the passenger seat, staring out the window as his mind raced. The fear hadn't left him, not even with Aunt Linda beside him. It lingered, like a dark cloud hanging over his every thought. Linda's hands were tight on the steering wheel, her knuckles white as she maneuvered through the quiet streets. Ethan could feel the tension radiating off her, but she kept her focus on the road. He knew she was trying to stay calm for his sake, but it was clear that the gravity of the situation weighed heavily on her too. "Are you sure they'll believe us?" Ethan asked, his voice small in the quiet of the car. Linda glanced over at him, her expression softening for a moment. "They will. They have to. We're not going to let Victoria get away with this, Ethan. I promise you that." Her words were meant to be comforting, but Ethan couldn't shake the sinking feeling in his gut. What if they were wrong? What if the police didn't believe them? Or worse, what if they couldn't prove anything in time? Victoria was smart, too smart. She'd been careful, and his father was blind to it all. The thought of James, so close to danger and completely unaware, made Ethan's stomach churn. He could see his father's face in his mind, still full of that cold detachment, the way he had looked at him earlier, as if Ethan were just some confused kid. The pain of that dismissal cut deep, deeper than he'd ever admit out loud. "Dad's not going to believe any of this," he muttered, more to himself than to Linda. Linda was quiet for a moment, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Maybe not at first," she said carefully, "but once we have the police involved, he won't have a choice. He'll see the truth, Ethan. We just need to be strong right now." It was a word that seemed foreign to Ethan in that moment. How could he be strong when everything felt like it was falling apart? When the one person he needed to believe him had turned his back? He swallowed hard, trying to push down the swell of emotions rising in his chest. There was no time for that now. He had to stay focused. This wasn't just about him. It was about saving his father. They pulled into the parking lot of the police station, the fluorescent lights casting harsh, cold shadows across the pavement. Ethan's heart began to race again, the reality of what they were about to do sinking in fully. This was it. There was no turning back. "I don't," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I heard her. I know what I heard." Harris exchanged a glance with Linda before leaning forward again, his expression softening slightly. "Look, kid, I'm not saying I don't believe you, but without proof, there's not much we can do right now." Ethan felt the weight of those words like a punch to the gut. He had come all this way, poured his heart out, and it still wasn't enough. "But," Harris continued, "that doesn't mean we can't look into it. If this woman is planning something, we'll find out. I'll need to talk to your father, and we'll start gathering what we can." Ethan's chest tightened. Talking to his father. That was the part he feared most. What if James refused to listen? What if he brushed this off just like before? Linda reached over, squeezing his hand gently. "It's going to be okay," she whispered. "We're not giving up." Ethan nodded, but the fear still gnawed at him. The clock was ticking, and every second felt like it was slipping away. He could only hope that Detective Harris would find something, anything, to stop Victoria before it was too late. The ride back home was filled with a heavy, uncomfortable silence. Ethan sat quietly in the passenger seat, staring out the window as the city lights flickered past. His thoughts were jumbled, a chaotic mix of hope, fear, and doubt. He knew Detective Harris was their best chance at stopping Victoria, but the conversation about proof still echoed painfully in his mind. Without something concrete, his father's life was hanging by a thread, and time was slipping away. Linda glanced at him occasionally, her brow furrowed in thought. She could feel the weight pressing down on Ethan, and it broke her heart to see him so burdened. She had always known there was something off about Victoria, but she hadn't expected it to be this dark, this dangerous. "Ethan," she said softly, breaking the silence, "I know this is hard, but we have to talk to your father. He needs to know what's going on." Ethan's chest tightened at the thought. His father, the man who had brushed off every warning he'd tried to give, was the last person he wanted to talk to right now. How could he convince James to see the truth when he was so wrapped up in Victoria's web? "What if he doesn't believe me?" Ethan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The vulnerability in his tone made Linda's heart ache. She reached over, gently placing her hand on his arm. "He's your father, Ethan. Deep down, he loves you. He might not see it now, but we have to try. This isn't just about us, it's about saving him." The words hit Ethan hard. Saving him. That was the crux of it all. It didn't matter if his father didn't believe him right away. What mattered was protecting him from Victoria's deadly plan. No matter how distant his father had become, Ethan couldn't let her take him away. Linda pulled into the driveway, cutting the engine as they both stared at the darkened house. The looming structure felt colder than ever, as if Victoria's presence had seeped into the very walls, casting a shadow over everything. Ethan's heart raced as they stepped out of the car, the sound of their footsteps echoing in the still night air. "Ready?" Linda asked, her voice steady but gentle. Ethan nodded, even though he didn't feel ready at all. But he had no choice. This was his chance, his father's only chance, and he couldn't back down now. As they entered the house, the soft glow of a lamp illuminated the living room. James was sitting on the couch, his suit jacket draped over the armrest, his tie loosened. He looked exhausted, the lines of stress etched deep into his face. For a brief moment, Ethan felt a pang of sympathy. His father had always worked so hard, always shouldered the weight of responsibility. But now that same sense of duty was blinding him to the danger right in front of him. James glanced up as they entered, his brow furrowing in confusion. "Linda, what are you doing here this late?" His eyes shifted to Ethan, his expression hardening slightly. "What's going on?" Linda didn't waste any time. She stepped forward, her voice firm. "James, we need to talk. It's about Victoria." The mention of her name made James sigh heavily. He leaned back on the couch, rubbing his temples as if preparing himself for another round of complaints. "Not this again," he muttered. "Ethan, I already told you." "No, James," Linda interrupted, her voice cutting through his dismissiveness. "You need to listen. This is serious." James looked up, startled by the intensity in her tone. His eyes flicked between Linda and Ethan, and for the first time a flicker of concern crossed his face. "What are you talking about?" Ethan took a deep breath, stepping forward. His heart pounded in his chest, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. "Dad, I overheard Victoria on the phone tonight. She's planning something terrible. She's going to hurt you. She's only with you for the insurance money." James stared at him, his expression unreadable. For a long moment the room was filled with a heavy silence, and Ethan's stomach twisted with anxiety. He could see the disbelief in his father's eyes, the same wall of denial that had been there every time he tried to bring up Victoria before. "Ethan," James said slowly, his voice tired, "I know you've had a hard time adjusting to Victoria being in our lives, but this is ridiculous. You're a kid. You don't understand the complexities of adult relationships." The words hit Ethan like a blow to the chest. His father's rejection, his refusal to even consider what he was saying, felt like a knife twisting in his heart. How could he be so blind? How could he not see the danger staring him in the face? "Dad, please," Ethan pleaded, his voice cracking with emotion. "I'm not making this up. She's going to hurt you. I heard her say it. She's planning to kill you." James stood up, his face hardening with frustration. "Enough, Ethan. I don't know what's gotten into you, but this needs to stop. Victoria loves me, and she's going to be your stepmother. You need to accept that." The finality in his father's voice made Ethan's heart sink. He felt tears burning in his eyes, but he blinked them back, refusing to let them fall. How could his father be so blind? How could he ignore the truth right in front of him? Linda stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. "James, I understand this is hard to hear, but you need to listen. Ethan is telling the truth. I've had my suspicions about Victoria for a long time, and what Ethan overheard tonight confirms it. We've already spoken to the police." The mention of the police made James pause, his eyes widening slightly. "The police? You went to the police about this?" "Yes," Linda replied, her gaze steady. "They're looking into it now, but we need your cooperation, James. This is about your safety." James shook his head, his expression one of disbelief. "This is insane. You really believe this? You think Victoria, my fiancée, is planning to kill me? This is absurd." "It's not absurd," Ethan said, his voice breaking with desperation. "Dad, I'm begging you, please believe me. I don't want to lose you." The vulnerability in Ethan's voice seemed to break through just for a moment. James looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time there was a flicker of something, doubt maybe, in his eyes. But it was gone as quickly as it came. "I don't know what to say," James muttered, rubbing his face with his hands. This is too much." Ethan's heart sank. His father wasn't ready to believe him, not fully. But there was no more time to convince him. Victoria's plan was in motion, and every second they wasted brought them closer to disaster. "You don't have to believe us right now," Linda said gently. "But you need to be careful, James. Stay away from Victoria until the police finish their investigation. Please, for your own safety." James didn't respond. He stood there, staring at the floor, his mind clearly racing. The weight of everything was pressing down on him, but Ethan couldn't tell if it was enough to break through the wall of denial. As the silence stretched on, Ethan felt the fear tightening in his chest again. He had done everything he could. He had told his father the truth, begged him to see reason. But now, all they could do was wait, and hope that it wasn't too late. The next morning felt like a haze. Ethan barely slept, his mind filled with racing thoughts and worst-case scenarios. Every creak of the house, every distant sound from outside sent a fresh wave of anxiety through him. He tossed and turned all night, his mind fixated on one haunting question. What if they were too late? As the pale morning light seeped through the curtains, Ethan finally gave up on trying to rest. He crawled out of bed, his body heavy with exhaustion, and made his way downstairs. The house was eerily quiet, the stillness unsettling. The faint smell of coffee lingered in the air, but there was no sign of his father. He hesitated in the doorway of the kitchen, his chest tightening with unease. Was James still here? Or had he gone to see Victoria? The thought made Ethan's stomach churn. As he stepped into the kitchen, his eyes caught sight of a note on the counter, hastily scrawled in his father's handwriting. He felt his heart sink as he picked it up, his hands trembling slightly. Had to go to the office. Don't worry, we'll talk tonight. Dad. Ethan's stomach clenched. Was his father really going to the office? Or was he heading straight into Victoria's trap? The uncertainty gnawed at him, twisting his insides. He dropped the note on the counter and rushed back upstairs, grabbing his phone from the bedside table. His fingers moved quickly as he dialed Aunt Linda's number, his heart pounding in his chest. Ethan. Her voice came through after the first ring, already filled with concern. He's gone, Ethan blurted out, his voice shaky. Dad's not here. He left a note saying he went to the office. But what if he's going to see her? What if... Calm down, Ethan, Linda interrupted, her voice soothing. We don't know for sure. Maybe he really is just at the office, but I'm coming over now, all right? We'll figure this out together. Ethan nodded, even though she couldn't see him. His chest felt tight, the fear still clawing at him, but knowing Linda was on her way gave him some comfort. They didn't have to wait long before the knock on the door echoed through the house. Ethan rushed to open it, relief flooding through him when he saw Linda standing there, her face serious but calm. "Any word from the police?" he asked, his voice filled with urgency. Linda shook her head as she stepped inside. "Not yet, but I've already called them this morning to let them know about your dad. They're going to send someone to keep an eye on him just in case." Ethan felt a small wave of relief, but it wasn't enough to ease the knot of anxiety still sitting in his chest. "What if they don't get there in time?" he whispered, the fear creeping back into his voice. Linda placed a hand on his shoulder, squeezing it gently. "We'll find him, Ethan, I promise. But we need to stay calm and think clearly, okay?" He nodded, though the fear still bubbled beneath the surface. Staying calm felt impossible right now. As they sat down in the living room, the minutes ticked by painfully slow. Ethan's mind raced, jumping from one horrible scenario to the next. He could barely sit still, his leg bouncing anxiously as he stared at the clock on the wall. "Maybe we should just go look for him," Ethan said, suddenly standing up. "What if he's with her right now?" "What if?" "Ethan, stop!" Linda's voice was firm but gentle, and it stopped him in his tracks. "The police are already on it. Running around the city won't help right now. We need to trust them to do their job." Ethan clenched his fists, frustration bubbling up inside him. How could he just sit here and wait when his father's life was hanging in the balance? But Linda was right. They couldn't do anything until they had more information. Just then, Ethan's phone buzzed on the table, cutting through the tense silence. He grabbed it quickly, his heart leaping into his throat when he saw the name on the screen. Dad. Without hesitation, he answered the call. Dad, where are you? There was a pause on the other end, followed by a heavy sigh. I'm at the office, Ethan, James said, his voice weary. I know you're worried, but I just needed some time to think. I'm not going to see Victoria. The words were meant to be reassuring, but Ethan's chest still tightened with doubt. Dad, you don't understand. She's dangerous. You can't. Ethan, I get it, James interrupted, his tone softer now. I know you're scared, but I'm okay. I need time to process everything. I've asked Victoria to give me some space until I figure things out. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. You did? Yeah, James replied. I've been thinking about what you and Linda said, and I don't know what to believe yet, but I'm not going to ignore it. I'm not going to ignore you. For the first time in days, Ethan felt a sliver of hope. His father was listening. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Just stay safe, Dad, Ethan said, his voice barely above a whisper. I will, James promised. I'll be home tonight, and we'll talk more then, okay? Ethan nodded, relief washing over him. Okay. The call ended, and Ethan sat back down, his heart still racing, but this time with a flicker of hope. His father wasn't going to see Victoria. He was taking their warnings seriously. Maybe, just maybe, they still had a chance. What did he say? Linda asked, watching him closely. He's at the office, Ethan replied, his voice steadier now. He's not seeing Victoria. He said he's thinking about everything we told him. Linda's shoulders relaxed slightly, but her eyes were still filled with concern. That's good, Ethan. But we can't let our guard down. Until the police find something concrete, we're not out of danger yet. Ethan nodded, the tension in his chest easing just a little. He knew Linda was right. Victoria wasn't going to give up easily, and they still had to be careful. But for the first time in a long time, he felt like there was a glimmer of light at the end of the tunnel. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Ethan tried to keep himself busy, but every minute felt like an eternity. His mind wouldn't stop racing. Even though his father had promised he was safe, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that Victoria wouldn't let go so easily. She was clever, calculating, someone who had been playing a long game. And now that her plans were being threatened, what would she do next? Linda stayed with him throughout the day, her presence a steady source of comfort. She made lunch, but neither of them ate much, their nerves too raw to focus on anything other than the ticking clock. The hours dragged on, and by the time the sun began to set, Ethan's stomach was in knots. Just as the evening shadows began to stretch across the room, Ethan's phone buzzed again. His heart skipped a beat as he picked it up, seeing an unknown number flashing on the screen. He glanced at Linda, who gave him a reassuring nod before he answered. Hello, Ethan Sullivan, a deep voice on the other end asked. It was unfamiliar but authoritative. Yes, this is Ethan, he replied, his voice tinged with uncertainty. This is Detective Harris. We've just finished going over some evidence we found related to your father's fiancée, Victoria. I think you and your aunt should come down to the station. Ethan's heart skipped. Evidence? His hands tightened around the phone, his voice barely steady as he replied, What did you find? It's better if we discuss this in person, Harris said, his tone giving nothing away. But you're going to want to hear this. The call ended quickly after that, leaving Ethan frozen in place, his mind spinning. He turned to Linda, who was already on her feet, her face etched with concern. The police found something, Ethan said quietly, his voice laced with a mix of hope and fear. "They want us to go to the station." Linda didn't waste any time. She grabbed her keys from the kitchen counter and ushered Ethan out the door, her expression determined but wary. The ride to the police station was silent, the tension between them palpable. Every second felt charged with anticipation, as if they were on the edge of a revelation that could change everything. When they arrived, Detective Harris was waiting for them in his office, his expression grim but focused. He gestured for them to sit, folding his hands in front of him on the desk. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest, his palms slick with sweat, as he waited for the detective to speak. "We've been investigating Victoria based on the information you gave us," Harris began, his voice steady. "And after some digging, we found some concerning details. It turns out this isn't the first time Victoria has been involved with someone who suddenly met an unfortunate end." Ethan felt his stomach drop, the fear creeping back in full force. He glanced at Linda, who was sitting up straighter now, her eyes narrowing as she listened intently. "There's a pattern," Harris continued. "Victoria, if that's even her real name, has been linked to the deaths of 2 other men in different states, both of whom she was engaged to at the time. Both deaths were ruled accidents, but each time she walked away with a significant amount of money from their life insurance policies." Ethan's heart pounded in his chest, the weight of the detective's words crashing down on him like a tidal wave. His suspicions, his worst fears, they were all true. Victoria wasn't just dangerous. She was a predator, someone who had done this before and gotten away with it. And now his father was next on her list. "We're in the process of pulling more records and gathering hard evidence," Harris went on, his tone serious. "But based on what we've found so far, it's clear that Victoria is a major threat. We're issuing a warrant for her arrest, but I need you both to be prepared. She might try to run." Linda's hand flew to her mouth, her face pale as she absorbed the information. What do we do now?" she asked, her voice shaking slightly. "We need to make sure your father is safe," Harris said firmly, turning to Ethan. "Where is he now?" "He's at the office," Ethan replied, his voice tight with fear. "But he said he would come home tonight. He still doesn't fully believe me, but he's starting to listen." "That's a start," Harris said, nodding. "But we need to act quickly. I'll have officers posted at your house, and we'll try to intercept Victoria before she gets to him. In the meantime, I need you both to stay somewhere safe." Ethan felt the panic rising in his chest again. This was all happening so fast, too fast. The thought of Victoria out there, knowing what she was capable of, made his skin crawl. What if they couldn't stop her in time? What if she got to his father before the police could? "Ethan," Linda said softly, pulling him from his spiraling thoughts. "We're going to protect your dad. The police are on it, okay? We're going to stop her." Ethan nodded, though his heart still raced with fear. He wanted to believe her. He wanted to believe that everything would be okay. But the truth was, they were up against someone who had outsmarted the system before. Someone who had killed before. And now it was a race against time. "We need to get back home," Linda said, turning to Harris. "If James is coming home tonight, I'll want to be there." Harris nodded, standing up from his desk. "We'll have a unit follow you. Don't worry, we're not letting Victoria out of our sight." The drive back to the house felt surreal. The tension was so thick it was almost suffocating, every minute feeling like a countdown to disaster. Ethan sat in the car, his hands clenched in his lap, his mind spinning with what Harris had told them. Victoria had done this before. Twice. And she had gotten away with it. The thought made Ethan's stomach churn. How could someone be so cold, so heartless? And worse, how had his father, how had anyone been fooled by her? Linda pulled into the driveway just as the first police car rolled up behind them. The officers stepped out, scanning the area as they took up their positions around the house. Ethan's heart pounded as he and Linda stepped inside, the familiar surroundings suddenly feeling like a battleground. "We just have to wait now," Linda said quietly, her voice tense. "Your dad will be home soon, and then we'll be safe." But even as she spoke the words, Ethan could see the fear flickering in her eyes. Neither of them truly believed they were safe. Not until Victoria was behind bars, not until his father was out of her reach. The minutes dragged by, each one a painful reminder of how close they were to danger. Ethan paced the living room, his mind racing with every possible scenario. What if Victoria showed up? What if she tried to get to his father before the police could stop her? What if? The sound of the front door unlocking cut through his thoughts like a knife. Ethan's heart leapt into his throat as he turned toward the door, his entire body tensing. His father stepped inside, looking exhausted but otherwise unaware of the storm that was about to crash down on him. "Dad," Ethan breathed, relief washing over him. "You're home." James looked at him, his face softening with something that resembled guilt. "Yeah, I'm home." But just as Ethan was about to say something, another sound, sharp, deliberate, rang through the house. The sound of footsteps. Linda shot up from the couch, her face pale. "Someone's here." Ethan's blood ran cold. His heart pounded in his ears as he turned toward the door. And then he saw her. Victoria. Standing in the doorway, her eyes dark and dangerous. The air in the house grew thick with an almost tangible tension. Ethan's breath hitched in his throat as he locked eyes with Victoria, her figure looming in the doorway like a shadow. There was something in her gaze, cold, calculating, that sent chills racing down his spine. He could see it now, the mask she wore, slipping just enough for him to glimpse the true danger beneath her polished exterior. "Victoria?" James's voice broke the silence, tinged with confusion. What are you doing here?" The question seemed so small, so meaningless compared to the gravity of the situation. Ethan's entire body was rigid, his mind screaming at him to act, to say something, but he couldn't move. He was frozen in place, trapped by the weight of what was about to happen. Victoria smiled, a slow, practiced smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I just came to check on you, darling," she said, her voice smooth and sweet. "I was worried. You've been distant lately." Every word out of her mouth made Ethan's skin crawl. He could see through her act now, the way she was trying to manipulate his father even in this moment. But he wasn't a child anymore. He knew the truth now. He knew what she really was. "You shouldn't be here," Linda said, her voice tight with controlled anger. She stood up, positioning herself protectively between Ethan and Victoria. "We've already called the police, Victoria. They're on their way." For the first time, something flickered in Victoria's eyes, a flash of anger, quickly masked by her composed expression. "The police?" she repeated, her tone sharp. "What is this, James? Why are the police involved?" James looked between Victoria and Linda, clearly caught off guard. I don't understand what's going on," he admitted, his voice filled with uncertainty. "Don't listen to them," Victoria said, her voice dripping with false sweetness, as she took a step closer to James. "They're trying to turn you against me." Ethan felt his stomach twist with dread. She was still playing her game, still trying to manipulate his father. He couldn't let her win. He couldn't let her get away with this. "Dad, no!" Ethan shouted, finally breaking through his paralysis. He stepped forward, his voice trembling with urgency. "She's lying to you. Everything she's told you is a lie. She's dangerous, Dad. She's planning to kill you." The words hung in the air like a blade, sharp and cutting. James turned to look at Ethan, confusion and disbelief warring in his eyes. "What are you talking about?" James asked, his voice shaky. "Victoria wouldn't—" "She's done it before," Ethan blurted out, his chest heaving as the fear and frustration poured out of him. "The police found out. She's been engaged twice before and both men ended up dead. She took the insurance money just like she's trying to do with you." James's face went pale, the shock evident in his eyes. For a long moment he didn't say anything, his gaze flicking between Ethan, Linda, and Victoria, as if trying to piece together the impossible puzzle in front of him. Victoria's smile faltered for just a second, her mask slipping further. "James," she said softly, taking a step toward him. "You don't believe them, do you? After everything we've been through, they're just trying to tear us apart." There was a hint of desperation in her voice now, a sharpness that hadn't been there before. It sent a fresh wave of fear through Ethan's chest. She was losing control, and that made her even more dangerous. James hesitated, his eyes wide with confusion. "I don't know what to believe." "Believe me," Ethan said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Please, Dad, I'm telling you the truth. She doesn't love you. She never did." The silence that followed was deafening. Ethan could hear his own heart pounding in his ears, the tension in the room so thick it was suffocating. Victoria's eyes darkened, her gaze flicked to Ethan, cold and calculating. "You've always been in the way," she said, her voice dropping the sweet pretense entirely. "You never wanted us to be happy." Ethan felt the weight of her words, the venom behind them, but he stood his ground. He wasn't going to back down. Not now. "Victoria," Linda said, her voice strong and unyielding. "It's over. The police know everything. There's no way out for you." That was when Ethan saw it. The moment everything changed. The shift in Victoria's posture, the way her eyes narrowed, the calculating look that crossed her face. She wasn't going to run, she was going to fight. Before anyone could react, Victoria lunged. Everything happened so fast. Ethan barely had time to register the movement before Linda shoved him back, her own body blocking Victoria's path. The force of the impact sent them both stumbling, but Victoria was quick. Too quick. Ethan heard the sharp clatter of something metal hitting the floor. Victoria had a knife. "No," James's voice boomed through the room as he lunged toward Victoria, grabbing her arm just before the blade could strike. There was a struggle, a blur of movement and shouts as James wrestled with her, trying to disarm her. Ethan's heart raced, his entire body trembling with fear as he watched, powerless to stop it. And then, as if in slow motion, James twisted the knife from Victoria's hand, sending it clattering to the floor. Victoria screamed, her face contorted with fury as she fought against him, but James held her back, his grip unyielding. "Get the police!" James shouted at Linda, his voice strained as he held Victoria in place. "Now!" Linda rushed to the door, throwing it open just as the officers stormed inside, their weapons drawn. The room erupted into chaos as the police moved in, forcing Victoria to the ground and cuffing her hands behind her back. Ethan stood frozen, his heart still racing, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. The danger, the fear, the rush of adrenaline, it all left him feeling numb, his legs weak beneath him. "It's over," Linda whispered, wrapping her arms around him. "It's finally over." The words felt distant, like they belonged to someone else. But as he looked at his father, who was staring at the scene with wide, horrified eyes, Ethan knew that in some way it really was over. Victoria was gone. She couldn't hurt them anymore. But the weight of what had nearly happened lingered, heavy and suffocating. James's face was pale, his expression filled with a mix of shock and guilt. He looked at Ethan, his eyes filled with something Ethan hadn't seen in a long time. Regret. "Ethan," James whispered, his voice hoarse, "I'm so sorry." And in that moment, as his father's words hung in the air, Ethan felt something break inside of him, a dam of emotions that had been building for what felt like forever. The tears came hot and fast, spilling down his cheeks as he finally let go of the fear, the anger, the pain. Linda held him close, whispering words of comfort, but all Ethan could hear was the pounding of his own heart, the flood of emotions crashing over him in waves. They had survived. They were safe. But nothing would ever be the same again. The house was eerily quiet once the police left. The flashing lights of the patrol cars faded into the night, leaving behind an unsettling stillness. Ethan sat on the couch, his hands trembling slightly as the adrenaline slowly drained from his body. It felt surreal, as if the events of the past hour had been part of some terrible nightmare. But the weight in his chest reminded him that it was real, every terrifying second of it. Victoria was gone. The woman who had nearly destroyed their family was in handcuffs, taken away by the police. But the damage she had done, the cracks she had left behind, were still there, lingering in the silence that filled the room. James stood by the window, his back to Ethan and Linda, his hands gripping the windowsill as he stared out into the darkness. He hadn't said much since the police had taken Victoria away, his face pale and drawn. Ethan could feel the tension radiating off him, the guilt that hung heavy in the air. Ethan watched his father from where he sat, the distance between them feeling more vast than ever. So many emotions swirled inside him: relief, fear, anger, sadness. But above all, there was an ache, a longing for things to go back to the way they were. But deep down, he knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The sound of Linda clearing her throat broke the silence, and she placed a gentle hand on Ethan's shoulder. "I'll give you two some time to talk," she said softly, her eyes filled with understanding. "You both need this." Ethan nodded, grateful for her presence, but knowing she was right. There were things he needed to say, things that had been buried deep inside him for too long. But as Linda quietly left the room, closing the door behind her, Ethan felt his throat tighten. The words he had rehearsed in his mind seemed to vanish, replaced by a heavy silence that pressed down on him. James didn't turn around. He just stood there, his shoulders tense, his body rigid. For a moment, Ethan wasn't sure if his father would speak at all. But then finally, James let out a shaky breath, his voice barely above a whisper. "I should have listened to you." The words hung in the air like a weight, and Ethan felt his chest tighten. He swallowed hard, trying to find his voice, but it felt stuck in his throat. "I should have seen it," James continued, his voice thick with regret. "All those times you tried to warn me, I didn't listen. I was so caught up in everything else. I let you down, Ethan." Ethan's eyes stung with unshed tears. He wanted to speak, to tell his father it was okay. But the pain of everything they had gone through was still so raw, so overwhelming. "I just wanted us to be a family again," James whispered, his voice breaking. "I thought Victoria was the answer. I thought she could fix everything that was broken after your mum, but I was wrong. I was so wrong." The mention of his mother hit Ethan like a punch to the gut. The loss of her had created a wound in their family, that had never fully healed. And for the first time, Ethan saw just how much that loss had weighed on his father. He had been trying to fill the void, to fix what was shattered, but in doing so, he had lost sight of what really mattered. "Dad," Ethan's voice cracked as he finally spoke. "I just wanted you to see me." James turned around slowly, his eyes filled with tears, and the sight of his father so vulnerable, so broken, made something inside Ethan unravel. For so long, he had felt invisible, pushed aside, like he didn't matter. But now, standing before him, was the father he had missed, the father who had always been his hero, even if he hadn't realized it. "I'm so sorry," James said, his voice choked with emotion. "I didn't see how much I was hurting you. I thought I was doing what was best, but I failed you." Ethan felt the tears slip down his cheeks, hot and fast, as the words he had been holding inside for so long finally spilled out. "I needed you, Dad. After Mom, I needed you. But you were always working, always busy, and then when Victoria came, it was like I didn't even exist." The pain in his voice was palpable, and it cut through James like a blade. He stepped forward, his hands shaking as he reached for Ethan's shoulders. "I know," he whispered. "I know, and I'm so sorry. I thought I was doing the right thing, keeping busy, trying to move on. But I didn't see how much I was hurting you. I should have been there for you. I should have listened." Ethan looked up at his father, his vision blurred with tears. "I thought I was going to lose you," he whispered, his voice trembling with emotion. "I was so scared." James pulled him into a hug, his arms wrapping tightly around Ethan as if he were afraid to let go. "I'm here," James whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm not going anywhere, I promise." They stood there for a long time, holding on to each other, the weight of the past few weeks, and the years before that, finally crashing down on them. The pain, the fear, the distance that had grown between them, it all seemed to melt away in that moment, replaced by a shared understanding of just how much they had both lost. "I'm going to be better, Ethan," James said softly, pulling back just enough to look his son in the eyes. "I'm going to be the father you need. No more distractions, no more excuses. I'll be here for you." Ethan nodded, his heart full but heavy with the weight of everything they had been through. He wanted to believe his father, wanted to trust that things would be different now. And for the first time in a long time, he felt a flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, they could find their way back to each other. "I believe you," Ethan whispered, wiping the tears from his cheeks. James smiled softly, his own eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Thank you," he said quietly. "Thank you for not giving up on me." For the first time in what felt like forever, Ethan felt a sense of peace settle over him. The danger was over, the threat was gone, and now, finally, they had a chance to rebuild. It wouldn't be easy. The scars from what had happened would linger, but at least now they could face the future together. The days that followed Victoria's arrest were a whirlwind of emotions. The relief of knowing she was gone, that she could no longer hurt them, was mixed with a lingering heaviness that clung to Ethan's heart. It wasn't just the fear or the danger that weighed on him. It was the knowledge that his father had nearly been lost, both physically and emotionally. As the police continued their investigation, more of Victoria's past came to light. The stories Detective Harris had uncovered were just the beginning. With each new revelation, it became clearer just how close James had come to being her next victim. The thought of it made Ethan's stomach twist, the what-ifs circling in his mind. What if he hadn't overheard that phone call? What if his father had never believed him? What if Victoria had succeeded? But there was no point in dwelling on the what-ifs. They were safe now, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Ethan and his father were starting to rebuild their relationship. James had taken time off from work, something Ethan had never seen him do before. He had always been so focused on his job, so consumed by the demands of being a lawyer, that Ethan had come to accept that his father was never fully present. But now, with Victoria gone, it was as if something had shifted in him. He was trying, really trying, to be there for Ethan. They spent more time together, small moments that Ethan cherished more than he could express. James wasn't perfect, and there were still moments when the old distance crept in, but it was different now. There was an effort, an awareness that hadn't been there before. One afternoon, as the sun cast a golden glow over the living room, James sat down beside Ethan on the couch. There was a quiet between them, the kind of silence that felt comfortable rather than strained. "You know," James began, his voice soft, "I've been thinking a lot about everything that's happened." Ethan glanced over at him, sensing the weight behind his words. "I didn't just fail you by not listening about Victoria," James continued, his gaze fixed on the window. "I failed you after your mother died. I thought throwing myself into work was the answer, that keeping busy would somehow make everything better. But I see now that it just made things worse." Ethan didn't say anything for a moment, letting his father's words sink in. He had waited so long to hear his father acknowledge the pain he had caused, and now that it was finally happening, the emotions welled up inside him all over again. "I missed out on so much," James said quietly, his voice filled with regret. "I missed you growing up. I missed us." The words hung in the air, and for the first time, Ethan felt the full weight of his father's guilt. He had been angry for so long, angry at the distance, angry at the neglect. But now, sitting here with his father, he realized something else. His father had been hurting too. They had both been lost, drifting in their own pain. "We both did," Ethan said softly, his voice steady despite the emotions bubbling beneath the surface. "But we can fix it now, right?" James looked over at him, his eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and hope. "Yeah," he said, nodding slowly. "We can fix it." They sat there for a while longer, the unspoken promise between them hanging in the air. It wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't happen overnight, but for the first time, Ethan felt like they were on the right path. With the looming threat of Victoria behind them, Ethan found himself navigating the emotional aftermath of everything they had been through. School had resumed, and though life seemed to be returning to a sense of normalcy, he couldn't shake the lingering shadows that followed him. He still had nightmares, dark, unsettling dreams where he was trapped, unable to save his father from danger. One afternoon, after school, Ethan met up with Marcus. They hadn't talked much during the ordeal, mostly because Ethan hadn't known how to explain what had happened. But Marcus, as always, was there, no questions asked, just ready to listen. "So it's over, huh?" Marcus asked as they sat on the swings at the park, the chains creaking softly in the breeze. Ethan nodded, staring at the ground. "Yeah, she's gone. Victoria's in jail." Marcus was quiet for a moment before he glanced over at Ethan. "But it doesn't feel over, does it?" Ethan looked up, surprised by the insight in his friend's words. "No," he admitted softly. "It doesn't. I keep thinking about everything that almost happened. It's like, I don't know, like it's still following me." Marcus nodded thoughtfully, pushing off the ground slightly to make the swing move. "That makes sense. I mean, it was a lot. I don't think stuff like that just goes away. Yeah, Ethan said, his voice distant as he thought about it. It's just weird, I guess. Things with my dad are better now, but sometimes it feels like there's this weight, like everything's different, even though it's supposed to be normal again. Marcus kicked at the ground, sending a cloud of dust into the air. Maybe it's okay for things to be different, he said after a while. I mean, you went through a lot, man. You changed. Your dad changed. Maybe it's just about figuring out what the new normal is. There was a wisdom in Marcus's words that Ethan hadn't expected, and it made him think. Maybe things weren't supposed to go back to the way they were. Maybe the new normal was something else, something better. But it would take time to heal, time to adjust. I guess so, Ethan said finally, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Thanks, Marcus. Hey, that's what best friends are for, Marcus replied with a grin, giving him a playful nudge. You're not getting rid of me that easily. For the first time in days, Ethan laughed, really laughed, and for a brief moment, the weight he had been carrying felt a little lighter. Ethan and his father continued to work on their relationship, but healing didn't happen overnight. There were still moments of awkwardness, times when James would retreat into himself and Ethan would feel the distance creeping back. But those moments were fewer and farther between. Every day they found new ways to connect, small gestures that meant more than words. One evening, as they sat together in the backyard, watching the sky fade from blue to deep orange, James turned to Ethan with a thoughtful look in his eyes. Do you remember when we used to come out here with your mom? James asked, his voice soft and filled with nostalgia. Ethan smiled faintly, the memories coming back in a rush. Yeah, she used to make us hot chocolate, even when it was warm outside. James chuckled softly, shaking his head. She was something else. There was a brief pause before James added, I miss her. Me too, Ethan said quietly. They sat in silence for a while, the unspoken grief between them like a gentle presence that neither of them had to hide from anymore. I've been thinking, James continued after a moment, his tone more serious now. I've been thinking about how I handled things after she died. I thought that if I didn't talk about her, if I just focused on work, it would hurt less. But I realize now that it only made it worse, for both of us. Ethan nodded, his heart heavy with the truth of his father's words. I think I was mad at you for a long time, he admitted. I didn't get why you weren't there, why you didn't seem to care. But I get it now. You were hurting too. James looked at him, his expression filled with regret. I wish I could go back and change it all, Ethan, but I can't. All I can do now is be better, be here for you the way I should have been. There was a sincerity in his father's voice that made Ethan's chest tighten. He had waited so long to hear those words, to feel like his father was finally seeing him. And now, as they sat together in the fading light, he realized that maybe things really could be different. We'll figure it out, Ethan said softly. Together. James smiled, a small but genuine smile, and for the first time in a long time, Ethan felt like they were finally moving forward. Time passed, and though the scars of what had happened remained, life slowly found its new rhythm. Ethan returned to school, his nightmares becoming less frequent. He and James had established a new kind of normal, one built on openness, honesty, and the promise that they would always be there for each other. Ethan still thought about Victoria sometimes, about how close they had come to losing everything. But instead of fear, those thoughts now served as a reminder of what they had overcome. He had been strong when it mattered, and in the end, they had made it through together. One evening, after dinner, James approached Ethan with a look of quiet determination on his face. "I've been thinking about something," he said, sitting down at the kitchen table. "I think it's time we do something to honor your mother." Ethan blinked, surprised by the suddenness of the suggestion. "What do you mean?" "I've been thinking about how much she loved helping people," James explained. "She was always volunteering, always finding ways to make a difference. I was thinking we could start some kind of memorial in her name, a scholarship or something that would keep her spirit alive." Ethan felt a lump rise in his throat at the thought. His mother had always been the heart of their family, and the idea of honoring her in such a meaningful way felt right. "I think she'd like that," Ethan said softly. "Me too," James agreed, his voice thick with emotion. "I just want to make sure that we don't forget her, that we don't forget what she meant to us." "We won't," Ethan promised, his heart swelling with love and pride. "We'll make sure everyone remembers." And as they sat together, planning how to honor the memory of the woman they had both loved so much, Ethan felt a sense of peace settle over him, a peace that came from knowing that no matter what they had been through, they were moving forward together, stronger, closer, and ready to face whatever came next.